All right, good morning, everyone. We'll get started, try to stay on schedule. I'm Alan Carr. Welcome again to day 2 of the Needham Healthcare Conference. We're pleased to have Albireo with us this morning, and to give us an overview and update, we have Simon Harford, CFO. Simon?
Thank you, Alan, and good morning to you all. For those of you who don't know Albireo, we are essentially a 10-year-old company. We're a leader in the development of bile acid modulators, and we're actually originally a spin-out from AstraZeneca. A4250, an IBAT inhibitor, is our lead asset for the treatment of pediatric liver diseases with numerous regulatory designations. Elobixibat, a second IBAT inhibitor, is approved also in Japan for chronic constipation, which is actually the first global approval of an IBAT inhibitor anywhere in the world. We also have several programs in NASH, and our financial position at this stage is extremely strong. Essentially, at the end of 2018, we had about $164 million worth of cash, which we have said will take us into 2021, past the filing of our lead asset for PFIC, or progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis. If we look at our pipeline, we really break it down into 2 categories: those for independent commercialization and those for partnering. For independent commercialization, our lead asset of A4250 is for pediatric liver disease, and key areas of focus for us are all indications impacted by high levels of serum bile acids. We chose PFIC, or progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis, as the first indication because PFIC is really all about bile acids, and therefore it's reasonable to assume it could have a higher probability of success. For partnering, Elobixibat is our key asset, where we have the rights everywhere except Japan, and we have a two-pronged sort of approach to NASH with Elobixibat and with some preclinical assets. So we're pursuing a proof of concept study in NASH, and we have also done some work in preclinical assets that we will talk about in the future if they advance according to plan. And finally, down at the bottom, we have A3384, which is essentially a proprietary reformulation of cholestyramine for BAM, or what is called bile acid malabsorption. Albireo went public in November of 2016, and we believe that we are really delivering on what we said we would do when we went public. In orphan diseases, our lead asset, after completing phase 2 successfully, is progressing with enrollment in the phase 3 trial for PFIC, and we have also, over the last year or so, strengthened our IP with additional patents around that product. Elobixibat is now launched in Japan with our partner EA Pharma, and as a result of that, we actually monetize the royalty, and together with equity financing, that's how we arrive at the $164 million of cash that we had at the end of 2018. And we have a really quite good shareholder base with the likes of Perceptive, Baker Brothers, Fidelity, Aramark, ProCyte, and others. So from this slide, you can see that in 2019 and 2020, we have quite a bit going on. In 2019 specifically, there is a lot to do as enrollment with patients progresses in the PFIC-1 study, which is the PFIC phase 3 trial for our lead asset. And we plan for a major readout of top-line phase 3 data late in 2019 or early next year. But we're also broadening the pipeline with our NASH study with elebixabat starting in Q2, and we are also planning to initiate a pivotal program in biliary atresia for A4250, our lead asset, in the second half of 2019, with additional potential indications to follow in the future. And assuming all goes well, we would hope to launch A4250 for PFIC in the first half of 2021. In terms of development, I would say that we've taken a kind of a multi-disease development approach to A4250. There are many diseases with cholestasis of the liver, as you can see on this chart. However, we're really focused on those that are in the blue indications for PFIC, biliary atresia, Alagille syndrome, and PSC, or primary sclerosing cholangitis, which is essentially scarring of the bile ducts. And for those diseases on the previous slide in blue, the total patient population potential is somewhere in the region of about 30,000 to 40,000 patients, based on estimated prevalence in the US and the EU, and there are no approved drug indications for any of these patients. All of these diseases are treated essentially by the same people, so that would be pediatric hepatologists. And it's important to note, obviously, that there is no published prevalence data, so the estimates as they relate to the US and Europe are really based on published regional populations, published incidence data, etc. And we're starting, obviously, with PFIC, the phase 3 trial, which together with BRIC patients, and BRIC patients essentially have the same symptoms, but they are more episodic. The total population is roughly 8,000 to 10,000 patients. The pure PFIC segment of that is estimated to be about 35% of the total number. And the second indication for biliary atresia would broaden the potential patient population with an additional estimated 15,000 to 20,000 patients. So what is PFIC, or progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis? PFIC presents itself in infants typically at 1 to 2 years of age. These are kids who have pruritus or chronic itching. This is not just some serious form of eczema. These children really scratch their skin all over until it is literally raw and bleeding. And some parents, just to give you an idea of how serious this is, some parents literally wrap their children in bandages up to their necks to go to sleep at night to stop the scratching. It's that bad. It's a genetic disorder based on one of 4 genes, and it progresses to inflammation, fibrosis, cirrhosis, and eventually death, with a median survival of about 15 years in PFIC patients. For those patients who have the episodic version, BRIC, the median survival is closer to about 30 years. And currently there are no approved drug treatments, so there is a tendency for physicians to use off-label drugs. Surgical options are liver transplants, with all the risks of infection and comorbidity that go with that, and obviously assuming you can find the appropriate donor. Some PFIC patients even have transplants, not because they need a new liver per se, but due to the pruritus, which obviously then moves the patient from being just a PFIC patient to being a liver transplant patient with all the challenges that go with that. But that gives you some feel for how serious the pruritus is when people feel the need to go forward with a liver transplant, even if the liver is not the primary cause. And also there is what's known as partial external biliary diversion, or PEBD surgery, which works in about 2/3 to 3/4 of cases. But for a baby at 18 months old, the concept of having an external stoma bag or a drainage bag from the gallbladder to drain bile acids is not what most parents obviously want for their child, particularly given they're going to have to live with that most likely for the rest of their lives. So what A4250 brings is a suitable drug for pediatric use and for compliance, which is important because these patients will be on the drug for life. It's a once-daily oral drug. It is not absorbed into the blood, and it has good tolerability from a profile perspective, including we have seen no evidence of diarrhea to date in the phase 2 study. PEBD surgery, or partial external biliary diversion, also provides a strong clinical rationale for the potential benefit of the IBAT inhibition mechanism. On the left, you can see that serum bile acid levels dropped approximately 50% after 1 year and after the surgery. In the middle, this is data from the NAPID consortium, which has probably the most extensive database of PFIC patients. What this shows here is that native liver survival with PEBD surgery is about 75% in 18-year-olds. But if you don't have that surgery where the bile acids have been reduced, then it's more like 25%. And on the right, for patients with serum bile acid levels that in absolute terms are less than 100, most of us have probably 20 to 30 as a reading as normal individuals. Most patients with PFIC have levels sort of in the 250 to 350 range. But what this shows is that if you can get bile acids down below 100, in all cases, they had native liver still after 15 years, whereas for those who were above 100, the level was significantly less. So in our phase 2 open-label study in all patients with cholestatic liver disease, we saw a mean reduction in serum bile acids of about 60% at 4 weeks, compared to approximately the 50% I mentioned after 1 year for patients with PEBD surgery. And specifically in the PFIC patient group, which was about 11 patients out of the 24, we saw a reduction in serum bile acid levels of about 71% at 4 weeks. And here also from the phase 2 study, you can see various scales that are used to really measure itch level. And in the phase 2 study, they clearly showed a statistical correlation between decreases in serum bile acids and a reduction in pruritus with triple-digit p-values. So overall, a favorable tolerability profile. We didn't see any adverse events related to treatment, no evidence of diarrhea, and obviously as an oral drug, we believe it will be particularly well suited to this patient population. In terms of the phase 3 trial, which we call PEDFIC-1, and then there is an open-label extension, PEDFIC-2. Essentially, this is a double-blind, placebo-controlled study with 60 patients to demonstrate, obviously, efficacy and safety. We believe the study is actually less risky than the phase 2 trial because of tighter inclusion criteria, resulting in a much more homogeneous group of patients. Treatment is for 24 weeks compared with 4 weeks in the phase 2 trial, basically on 2 doses of 40 and 120 micrograms per kg per day, and we hope to commercialize probably the 120 microgram version if all goes according to plan. In addition to that, we are supporting this trial with data from NAPID, from their natural history study, which, as I mentioned, is the largest sort of collection of PFIC data with nearly 600 patients. And enrollment in this study continues to progress. And as I mentioned earlier, we expect to see the top line readout either at the end of this year or the beginning of 2020. And in terms of filing and launch readiness, for manufacturing, regulatory, and commercial, we continue to be on track with nothing that's specifically on the critical path at this stage. We also announced recently the hiring of our Chief Commercial Officer, Pamela Stevenson, who's here with me today. Pamela joined us from Vertex, where she led the global market access and pricing strategy group and played key roles in launches of drugs for cystic fibrosis and hepatitis. And before that, she spent 10 years at Pfizer, involved in numerous product launches. So we are delighted to have her here, and I think it speaks to the desire of our CEO, Ron Cooper, to build a management team that has both scientific experience as well as commercialization experience. Moving on to other areas, we announced on our earnings call in March that we plan to expand into a second indication for A4250 with the planned start of a pivotal trial in the second half of this year in biliary atresia. It is also our intention, if all goes according to plan, to pursue another indication for development most likely next year. And in terms of sort of biliary atresia is essentially the partial or total blockage of the bile ducts, which prevents the flow of bile from the liver to the small intestine. It is the most common pediatric liver disease leading to transplants, with 80% requiring a transplant by the age of 20 years old. We have received orphan drug designation also for biliary atresia in the US and Europe, and are working, frankly, with the regulatory authorities to finalize the trial design for the pivotal program at this point in time. So in summary, there's a high unmet medical need for pediatric cholestatic liver diseases with no approved drug, which provides, in our mind, a really compelling opportunity for A4250 as our lead asset. In terms of other pipeline programs that we might partner in the future, NASH is a key element of that. We think about NASH as a liver manifestation of metabolic issues, where most patients succumb actually to death from cardiovascular disease rather than from the liver. As an asymptomatic disease, having a safe, highly tolerable product with little side effects is clearly desirable, and we think that's what elobixibat, given its profile as an IBAT inhibitor, would provide. Our thinking is, and our hypothesis is, we believe that it's worth exploring our IBAT inhibitor, elobixibat, in NASH, because what you see here is, in both of these graphs, is that bile acids are elevated in NASH patients. And additionally, we know that NASH obviously is linked to cholesterol levels, insulin sensitivity, liver inflammation, and fibrosis. And we therefore believe there's a strong rationale for IBAT inhibitors in this space, as we have seen improvements in cholesterol in the clinic as well as in the clinic we have seen higher GLP-1 levels leading to decreasing insulin resistance. And in preclinical models, there has also been a reduction in inflammation and fibrosis improvement. So we think this gives us a hypothesis to explore elobixibat in this area. But it's really a two-pronged kind of approach that we're taking. A proof of concept study with elobixibat that will start this quarter. And we also have some preclinical sort of novel bile acid modulator assets, which we hope to share more on in the future, assuming they progress according to plan. So in summary, we're extremely excited about this year. Obviously, this is a very important year for us with the readout of the phase 3 data in PFIC at the end of the year or the very beginning of next year being the highlight. But clearly it's beyond just that. It's also the second indication being initiated with a pivotal study during the second half of 2019, obviously initiating the phase 2A study for elobixibat in NASH. So we continue to sort of build out the story and the investment thesis behind Albireo as we go forward from here. But clearly everyone will be waiting for the top line data. So with that, thank you.
We've got a presentation coming up in EASL in a few days around that phase 2 program. Tell us about that, what we expect to see.
Yeah, I would say that the data that is being presented at EASL, there is an oral presentation of the sort of efficacy of A4250 in Alagille syndrome from the phase 2 study. There is also a poster presentation on biliary atresia data from that phase 2 study. I would describe them as more supportive data, Alan. That continues to build the knowledge for people is maybe the best way to think of it.
Okay, and then when you all announced it from the Champagne 4254, the second indication of biliary atresia, maybe you can comment on why that particular indication is for Alagille and maybe the others?
Yeah.
Consideration like that?
So really a couple of reasons. One, obviously, as we've been through discussions with regulatory authorities, there is clearly a desire to do something in biliary atresia. When you look at that patient population, I think I'm right in saying it accounts for roughly 50% of liver transplants in children and about 10% of liver transplants overall. So that's important. When you think about these patients, without some form of transplant, these only 1 in 4 patients actually lives beyond about 20. So this is a very serious indication, tied again to bile acids. So as we've sort of discussed with regulatory authorities, this seemed the right place to go next.
What's going to influence? You have a poster that you plan or stated you plan to look at some other indications too, other rare pediatrics. What influences your decision process on those sections to go after certain factors and certain drive that decision?
Yeah, we've tried to focus down very much overall. I showed you the kind of the slide with the blue indications. That's where we are primarily focused at the moment because they are pediatric orphan liver disease indications that are closely tied to bile acids. Obviously, if we are already doing PFIC, we're initiating in biliary atresia later this year, there are only a handful left, right? Exactly where we will go next is still subject to discussion. Of course, we sort of look at the competitive environment, and there aren't a lot of competitors out there, but there obviously is one specific competitor in that space that we also have to take into consideration. But we will make that decision probably once we are up and running with biliary atresia, because at this stage, that's really our priority focus as next step. But we're very thoughtful about not trying to rush everything in parallel, because we only have a certain level of capacity, and we want to make sure that we get the trial design for each indication correct, and that's why you've sort of seen us take a little bit more of a sequential approach to trials rather than a sort of in parallel approach to trials. And for us, at least, we think that has been an appropriate approach.
And then, now that you have Pam on board, where do things stand with the commercial prep and that sort of thing? Give us some details around strategy and planning for that.
Yeah, well, since Pamela's here, I'll maybe let her just stand up and answer.
To address that one. Oh, maybe someone.
Yeah, so the question being sort of where are we and where do we stand in terms of commercial readiness? I feel like we are in a really good place for a company of our size and the focus that we talked about. I think the opportunity we have here is to have a very focused effort. There are about 100 pediatric hepatologists here in the U.S., which is going to require a focused field force in terms of that footprint. So I think that's one angle. The other is just in terms of the value proposition that's needed to support reimbursement. I think that value proposition is quite compelling given the unmet need. And so in terms of commercial readiness, we are absolutely moving forward and we'll be ready.
I'm curious if you comment on how your strategy here might differ from your past experiences in Pfizer and Vertex, and how it's different and maybe some lessons from those others.
Yeah, no, great question. One of my most recent experience, I would say, is the most relevant. So being at Vertex and the effort that we put behind cystic fibrosis. Initially, when we launched Kalydeco, there was about 1,000 patients here in the U.S. with the first indication that we came out with. So I think a couple lessons learned. Like Simon said, to be able to focus on sort of in a sequential manner as you commercialize is really a smart way to do this. So that was one thing that I learned. And secondly, when it comes to sort of the value proposition that you're bringing out to patients and families and caregivers, physicians, as well as payers, having that strong science, which we have at Albireo, that focus on bile acid modulators and knowing the science behind the product, that's really important. And then also a focused number of patients. And so really for any singular payer, the budget impact is not going to be significant.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.